You can't skip the line just 'cause you're old. Get back and take a number like everyone else. The clerk's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. A few in the room smirked. Others stared at their phones, pretending not to notice. Walter Pierce, his hands trembling slightly, lowered his gaze. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. Silently, he turned, walked to the machine, and took a ticket. He stood there, forgotten, ignored, just an old man clutching a worn folder. 3 hours in line, no one cared, until two black SUVs screeched into the lot. The DMV fell silent. Doors swung open. Uniformed men stepped in. And then, a colonel called out, "Where is Mr. Walter Pierce?" And that moment changed everything. Walter Pierce was never a man of many words. Born in 1936 in a small farming town in southern Georgia, he learned early what it meant to work hard, to keep his promises, and to stand by others no matter the cost. His father was a mechanic who fixed farm equipment for neighbors who often couldn't afford to pay. His mother, a school teacher, believed that character mattered more than wealth. From them, Walter inherited a quiet sense of duty that would guide his every decision. At 18, as the world seemed poised between peace and conflict, Walter enlisted in the United States Army. He didn't do it for glory. He didn't do it for medals. He joined because he believed with all his heart that protecting others was simply what a man should do. Over the next 4 decades, that belief would take him from the dusty fields of Georgia to far-off battlefields across 2 wars. Walter became known not for shouting orders or chasing rank, but for the way he led by example. He rose through the ranks to become a senior instructor at Fort Moore, where he trained thousands of young recruits. Many were barely out of high school, frightened but eager. Walter's voice became the steady anchor for them, the voice that taught them to survive, to think, to care for the man next to them. His lessons weren't just about weapons or tactics. They were about honor, resilience, and doing what's right even when no one is watching. He never married. Some said he loved the Army too much to share his life with anyone else. But the truth was more tender. His heart belonged to his men, to those wide-eyed recruits he taught to face the unimaginable. He felt a deep responsibility to every soldier he trained, and the loss of even one weighed on him for years. Among the most powerful symbols of Walter's service was his Jeep M38. Assigned to him during his first deployment as an instructor, the Jeep was more than a vehicle. It carried him across training grounds, through flooded fields, over makeshift bridges, and into the heart of danger when duty called. Walter personally maintained it, tightening every bolt, checking every wire, not out of pride but because he knew lives depended on it. Over the years, the Jeep became a silent witness to moments of courage and heartbreak. It bore the mud of endless drills and the dust of farewell parades. There were nights Walter sat on its hood under starlit skies, writing letters to families of fallen soldiers. Letters he rewrote again and again, searching for the right words to honor young men who'd given everything. He could still remember the sound of boots on gravel, the nervous laughter before missions, the solemn silence when a flag was folded. After retirement, Walter kept the Jeep in his garage, not as a trophy, but as a piece of the past he couldn't let go. The Army had given him countless memories, but the Jeep reminded him most of those who didn't come home. The worn leather seats still bore the impressions of comrades who'd shared long talks and quiet moments. The paint, though faded, still carried the marks of the road, of service, of sacrifice. When he decided to donate the Jeep to the state's military museum, it wasn't about preserving a machine. It was about preserving a promise that the stories of the men he served with would not be forgotten. Walter wanted future generations to see that Jeep and understand what it represented. Not him, but the spirit of countless ordinary soldiers who did extraordinary things without ever seeking recognition. Walter Pierce's life was stitched together from small, steady acts of service. He was never interested in medals or headlines. His wealth was the respect of those he led, the trust of those he served, and the memory of those who never made it back. The Jeep M38 was his tribute to them, a lasting reminder that behind every machine, every mission, every victory or loss, there are human hearts that bear the weight of sacrifice. The Department of Motor Vehicles on that sweltering afternoon felt more like a holding cell than a public office. The air inside was heavy, thick with the combined scent of old carpet, sweat, and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed and flickered overhead, casting a cold, lifeless glow that flattened every surface and made the room feel even more oppressive. The battered linoleum floor, once white, had turned a weary shade of yellow, scuffed by thousands of impatient feet over the years. A digital display blinked red numbers. Now serving 16. The number 16 had held for what felt like an eternity. Walter Pierce sat near the back, close to an overflowing trash bin, clutching his leather folder to his chest like a lifeline. The folder was worn at the edges, the brown leather cracked from age and use, but it was clean, kept so out of respect for what it contained. His hands, spotted with age and lined from years of hard work, trembled slightly, though whether from the weight of memory or the strain of waiting, no one could say. Around him, the DMV was a symphony of sighs, shuffling papers, and the restless tapping of feet. A toddler whined somewhere near the front. A mother whispered sharply for quiet. Teenagers stared into their phones, thumbs dancing across screens in endless scrolls. Others in line glanced at the clock, at the ceiling, at the door, anywhere but at each other. They were strangers bound together by bureaucracy and the silent hope that somehow their number would be called next. Behind the counter stood Abby Miller, a woman in her late 20s whose red blazer and name tag did little to mask her exhaustion. She moved mechanically, stamping papers, sliding forms back and forth, with the speed of someone trying to beat the clock. Her ponytail had begun to fray at the edges, loose strands falling around her face. With each confused customer, her patience grew thinner. She let out exaggerated sighs when someone fumbled for a document. When an elderly man asked her to repeat something, she spoke louder, sharper, not to help him understand, but to make sure everyone heard her frustration. Earlier, when Walter had approached the counter without a number, she hadn't even looked up before snapping, "You can't skip the line just because you're old. Get back and take a number like everyone else." The words had cut through the room like a slap. A few people had smirked. Most looked away, embarrassed for him, or perhaps embarrassed by their own relief that they weren't the target. Walter hadn't argued. He hadn't pleaded. He had simply nodded, turned, and walked slowly to the ticket machine. The paper slip now rested on his lap. 92. The display still blinked 16. The minutes dragged on, each one indistinguishable from the last. The only sign of time passing was the growing tension in Walter's shoulders and the occasional change of number on the screen. He breathed in deeply, letting his gaze fall not on the impatient faces around him, but inward, back through the years to the long waits of a different kind. In his mind, the DMV's stuffy air transformed into the thick humidity of a jungle night. He remembered the taste of dust on desert patrols, the endless hours in a foxhole listening for sounds that didn't belong. He remembered the faces of young men, wide-eyed and weary, waiting for dawn, waiting for orders, waiting for news that never seemed to come. He remembered their names, each one. The shuffle of papers at the counter became in his memory the rustle of boots on gravel. The hum of the lights overhead became the low drone of a transport plane. The blinking red numbers on the display blurred and shifted until they felt like coordinates, call signs, mission codes. Walter's fingers tightened on the folder. Inside were the documents for the Jeep that had carried him and his men through all manner of terrain, the Jeep that had been there for the goodbyes he wished he'd never had to say. That folder wasn't just paper. It was a ledger of the life he'd led, the promises he'd kept, the men he'd tried to bring home. A loud sigh from Abby brought him back to the present. She slapped a form onto the counter, her voice rising in exasperation at the next customer's confusion over a signature box. Walter blinked, adjusting again to the cold light of the DMV. The weight of the folder in his lap felt heavier now, as if the memories themselves were pressing down on him. Nearby, two young men whispered to each other, glancing at Walter and then away, their amusement at the old man's quiet patience clear on their faces. A woman to his left shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing the wait would end. Walter remained still. He'd learned long ago the strength it took to wait, to endure, to let the world move at its own pace and find peace in the stillness. His heart was steady, his expression calm. Outwardly, he was just another tired old man in a government office. But inside, Walter Pierce was standing shoulder to shoulder with men he would never forget, waiting once again for a moment that would change everything. Captain Mason Carter had come to the DMV that afternoon for something as trivial as a license renewal. Like everyone else, he'd been frustrated by the heat, the endless wait, the slow crawl of the numbers on the screen. He stood in the line like any other citizen, his army service not granting him even the smallest advantage in this dreary government office. But as he stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his gaze kept drifting toward the elderly man seated at the back of the room. At first, Mason saw what everyone else saw, a tired old man, hunched and silent, clutching a folder as though it contained his last possession. But something about the man nagged at him, the way he held himself, the quiet dignity in his posture, the faded patch on his jacket's inner lining, barely visible at the cuff. Then as the old man adjusted his folder, a corner of a document slipped out just enough for Mason to catch sight of a name typed in block letters. Walter Pierce. Mason's heart skipped. That name wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. Growing up on stories from his father, Mason had heard about Walter Pierce, the senior instructor at Fort Moore who had trained generations of soldiers, including Mason's own father. The man who had shaped the backbone of so many young recruits. The man whose lessons were still spoken of in hushed respect in Army circles. And here he was, waiting quietly, invisible to almost everyone. Mason's breath quickened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man who had dedicated his life to building warriors, reduced to waiting for hours in a DMV, treated with indifference, with disrespect. He felt a flush of shame, not for Walter, but for the room, for himself, for not noticing sooner. He knew he had to act. Mason stepped out of line, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he found the direct line to Colonel Thomas Reed's office. The colonel wasn't just his superior, he was the head of statewide military affairs, a man who would understand the weight of this moment. When the colonel's aide picked up, Mason kept his voice low, steady, but urgent. "This is Captain Carter. I'm at the DMV on 5th and Main. Sir, Walter Pierce is here." Yes, that Walter Pierce. He's been waiting for hours. He's being ignored, disrespected. Sir, I think we need to intervene. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that told Mason the colonel understood the gravity of what he just heard. Then came the answer. "Stay with him. We're on our way." Mason pocketed his phone and glanced at Walter, who was quietly gathering his documents again, trying to slide a worn slip of paper back into the folder. His hands shook ever so slightly, not from weakness, but from the strain of holding so much memory, so much history in his grasp. When the folder slipped from his arm and fell to the floor, papers scattering at his feet, Mason was there in an instant. He bent down, helping Walter gather them, handling each page with reverence. Walter looked at him, confused by the sudden attention. "Please wait here a moment, sir," Mason said quietly, his voice filled with respect. Walter furrowed his brow. "Is something wrong?" Mason shook his head. "No, sir. Quite the opposite." And then it happened. The hum of conversation, the shuffle of impatience, it all stopped. Outside, the squeal of tires broke the afternoon lull. 2 black SUVs swept into the lot, their arrival as swift and precise as a military operation. Doors opened in unison. From the first SUV stepped Colonel Thomas Reed, his uniform immaculate, his face set with purpose. Behind him came a state aide and 2 active duty soldiers, their eyes scanning the building as if they were on a mission. Inside, the room fell utterly silent. People stared as the uniformed men entered, their boots clicking against the worn linoleum. The DMV director, caught off guard, rushed from her office, straightening her blouse, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. The colonel didn't stop to answer questions. His eyes swept the room, sharp and commanding. "Where is Mr. Walter Pierce?" His voice was clear, carrying the weight of history, of duty, of overdue respect. Walter, still standing near Mason, hesitated a moment before slowly raising his hand, as if unsure this could truly be happening. The colonel strode toward him, stopping directly in front of the man who had shaped generations. He extended his hand, not just as a greeting, but as a salute in its purest form. It's an honor to meet you, sir, and I'm sorry it took us this long. Walter took the colonel's hand, his expression one of quiet confusion mingled with deep humility. Around them, no one moved. The DMV, so noisy a moment before, held its breath, as if recognizing, too late, the greatness that had sat unnoticed among them. And in that moment, the entire room understood. Everything had changed. The room remained frozen in a breathless silence as Colonel Thomas Reed's hand met Walter Pierce's trembling one. It was a handshake filled with more meaning than any medal or citation could convey. The colonel, a man whose own career had been shaped by Walter's legacy, held that grip a moment longer, as if trying to pass back a fraction of the honor he felt standing before this forgotten hero. The DMV director, pale and wide-eyed, stepped forward, her voice faltering. "Colonel, I didn't know. If we had known, we would have—" But Reed raised a hand, stopping her words with a glance that spoke volumes. His attention never left Walter. He turned slightly, addressing the room with a voice that was both commanding and reverent. "This man is a military legend in our state. Walter Pierce trained half of the leadership in this region. Men and women who owe their lives, their discipline, their courage to the lessons he taught. For over 40 years, he shaped soldiers, not for fame, not for medals, but because he believed in service above self." Gasps echoed quietly around the room. Heads turned to look at Walter with new eyes, the weight of their earlier indifference settling heavy on their consciences. The teenagers who had smirked now sat up straighter. The woman who had pretended not to notice him now blinked back tears. Colonel Reed continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned crowd. "It is unacceptable that a man like Walter Pierce should ever be treated with anything less than respect. And it's a lesson for all of us. We never truly know who stands beside us, quietly carrying the weight of sacrifice." Abby Miller, who had earlier snapped at Walter, felt the heat of shame crawl up her neck. She tried to step back, hoping to disappear into the crowd, but the colonel's voice called her out. "Were you the one who assisted Mr. Pierce earlier?" Her voice was small, trembling. "Yes, sir. But I didn't know." The colonel's tone softened, but it held firm. "That's the point. You didn't know. And yet every person deserves to be treated as if they might be someone who gave everything so that you could stand here today. Learn from this. Let it change you." The DMV director, finding her courage, stepped closer to Walter, her hands clasped in apology. "Mr. Pierce, I am deeply sorry. We failed you today. Let me personally see that your business is handled properly." Walter, ever the quiet man, simply nodded. There was no bitterness in his eyes, only the same steady dignity he had carried through every trial in life. Without another word wasted, the process began. The director herself led Walter to her office, seating him with care and personally reviewing each document he carried. Forms that would have taken weeks were signed and approved in minutes. Phone calls were made, confirmations obtained. The colonel remained close by, overseeing every step, as if guarding Walter's honor now as fiercely as Walter had once guarded his recruits. By the time Walter stepped back out into the waiting area, the transformation was complete, not just in the paperwork, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the scene. What had begun as a day of indignity became a lesson that none of them would forget. The Jeep M38 that Walter had cherished for decades was transported the next morning by an official military tow team, its journey to the State Veterans Museum treated like the passage of a sacred relic. The museum staff, alerted by the colonel himself, prepared a space worthy of its history. When the vehicle arrived, it was greeted with respectful silence. Restoration experts worked to preserve its original paint, its leather seats, its worn but proud frame. Within weeks, the Jeep stood as the centerpiece of the new Veterans Hall exhibit. A bronze plaque was mounted beside it, the simple words etched deep, "Donated by Walter Pierce, distinguished instructor, honored citizen," in memory of those who served and those who never returned. Visitors to the museum paused longer at the Jeep than at any other display. Veterans would stand quietly before it, remembering their own journeys, their own mentors. Families would read the plaque aloud to their children, explaining what it meant to serve without seeking glory. And back at the DMV, the change did not end with that day. New training was implemented. Staff, including Abby, attended seminars on dignity and respect, led by none other than Captain Mason Carter. Policies were rewritten to ensure that elderly and disabled visitors received the assistance they deserved. And though Walter never asked for thanks, his quiet strength that day reshaped how the community treated its heroes. In the end, the greatest tribute was not in the plaque nor in the exhibit. It was in the way people learned to see differently, to recognize that behind every face might be a story of sacrifice, waiting only for someone to ask. 2 weeks later, Walter Pierce found himself standing once again before the familiar glass doors of the DMV. The building hadn't changed. The paint still peeled at the corners of the windows. The neon sign above the door still flickered uncertainly. But inside, something was different. Walter could feel it in the air, a subtle shift, like the stillness before dawn, when the world holds its breath, waiting for the sun to rise. In his hands, he carried the same worn leather folder. The documents inside were simpler this time, just paperwork for renewing his driver's license. The Jeep was gone now, resting in its rightful place at the Veterans Museum, a chapter closed with honor. Walter didn't seek any special attention today. All he wanted was to handle his business quietly, as he always had, and go home. But before he could reach the ticket machine, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Pierce!" Walter turned, and there was Abby Miller. Gone was the hurried, impatient clerk who had once dismissed him with a snap of irritation. Today her posture was different, upright but not rigid, purposeful yet respectful. Her expression was warm, and in her eyes was a glimmer of something Walter hadn't seen before: humility. She walked toward him quickly, almost as if afraid he might slip away before she could make things right. "You don't need to take a number," she said gently. "It would be my honor to assist you today. Please come with me." Walter hesitated for just a moment. He wasn't a man who ever wanted to be treated differently because of who he was or what he'd done, but he could see the sincerity in Abby's face, the genuine desire to not just correct a mistake, but to do what was right. He gave her a small nod and followed. She led him to a counter that had been freshly cleaned, its surface clear of the usual clutter. As she processed his renewal, she took extra care to double-check every detail, her voice steady and kind. "Is there anything else we can assist you with today, Mr. Pierce?" she asked as she handed him his new license. Walter slipped the card into his shirt pocket, his fingers brushing the smooth plastic. He shook his head with a small smile. "No, thank you. You've done more than enough." For a moment, Abby stood there, struggling with the words she wanted to say. Finally, she drew a quiet breath. "Mr. Pierce, I want to apologize again. I've thought a lot about what happened that day. I was wrong, and I'm grateful you gave us the chance to do better." Walter met her gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just remorse, but growth. And that to him mattered far more than any words. "We all make mistakes," he said simply. "What matters is learning from them." Around them, other staff watched, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Word of what had happened 2 weeks ago had spread. Captain Carter's training sessions, inspired by that day, had changed the way the staff viewed their work. Each visitor now was seen as a story waiting to be heard, not just a task to be checked off. Walter tipped his cap to Abby, a small gesture of acknowledgement, then turned toward the exit. But before he could leave, Abby called out softly, "Mr. Pierce, thank you for teaching me something that matters." He paused, looking back at her, and gave a small nod. There was no pride in his eyes, no sense of victory, just the quiet contentment of a man who had lived long enough to know that true change often begins with a single act of recognition. As Walter stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth on his face felt different somehow. The world hadn't changed overnight, he knew. But in this small corner of it, in this modest office where once he had been invisible, something good had taken root. And that was enough. In the end, Walter Pierce's story wasn't about a Jeep, a museum, or even the overdue recognition of his service. It was about something far more universal, something that speaks to every person who has ever stood quietly, hoping to be seen. Walter's journey reminded us that dignity isn't something granted by medals or titles. It's something that belongs to every individual, simply by virtue of their humanity. When Walter entered the DMV that first day, he didn't seek honor. He wasn't looking for applause or special treatment. All he wanted was to complete a task, to give something back to the world, just as he always had. But the world in its rush and impatience almost failed to see him. Almost. And yet, in that moment when the colonel's voice echoed through the room, "Where is Mr. Walter Pierce?" everything changed. Not just for Walter, but for everyone who witnessed it. The room, once filled with indifference, became a place of reflection. People began to ask themselves, who else have I overlooked? What stories have I ignored? Walter's story teaches us that true greatness often wears no badge. It doesn't announce itself. It waits quietly, humbly, doing what is right because that is what the heart commands. And when we fail to recognize it, we don't just dishonor the person before us, we dishonor ourselves. The transformation that followed at the DMV was not just about new policies or training sessions. It was about hearts changing, about seeing beyond the surface, about remembering that every person we meet carries memories, sacrifices, dreams, and battles we may never know. Walter's presence sparked that awakening, not through anger or demand, but through the simple power of his example. Perhaps that is the most important legacy of Walter Pierce. Not the Jeep displayed in the museum, not the plaque bearing his name, but the quiet reminder that kindness, patience, and respect should be the starting point for every encounter. Because behind every face is a story. Behind every quiet man or woman is a life filled with moments of courage, loss, and hope. So as we go about our own lives, rushing from task to task, caught up in the noise of the world, may we remember Walter's lesson. Slow down. Look closer. See the people around you, not for what they appear to be in that moment, but for the depth of what they've lived, what they've given, and what they might still give. In the end, we're all just hoping for the same thing, that someone will look at us, truly look at us, and say with their eyes, with their actions, "You matter." And sometimes that simple recognition can change everything. Walter Pierce's story is more than just a tale about an old veteran at a DMV. It's a reminder for all of us that respect and dignity should never go out of style. In today's world, where people are often in a hurry, where technology can make us look down at screens instead of into people's eyes, it's easy to forget that behind every quiet face is a story, a life of service, a life of sacrifice, a life that matters. Think about how often in modern America we rush through daily life, at the grocery store, at the bank, at the post office, and miss the chance to truly see the people around us. Walter's experience reminds us that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't ask for attention. They're the ones who stand patiently, waiting for someone to notice their quiet strength. This isn't just a story about one man. It's a lesson about how we, as a society, can choose to slow down, to listen, and to honor the lives that helped build the freedoms we enjoy. Walter didn't need applause. He didn't need special treatment. He just wanted to do what was right. And when people finally saw him for who he was, it changed the room, and it changed hearts. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this, where someone was overlooked only to later be honored? Or have you ever been in a situation where you misjudged someone's quiet presence? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could help inspire others to look a little deeper. And if Walter's journey moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the smallest gesture of respect makes the biggest difference.